The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the streets of Los Angeles shining under the soft glow of streetlights. The city was quiet, almost too quiet for a Friday night. Keanu Reeves parked his motorcycle near an old building that most people passed without a second glance. Its windows were fogged, and the faint scent of oil paint floated into the air. Above the door, a small metal sign read "The Studio," its letters half-rusted and almost invisible in the dark. Inside that building was a world frozen in time. For years, it had been Sandra Bullock's private art studio. Few people knew about it. Fewer had ever entered. This was where she painted when she needed peace, when she needed silence, when she needed to remember who she was. But tonight the light inside was off. The windows were covered. The brushes had been untouched for weeks. Keanu stood at the door with a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He hesitated before knocking, unsure if she would even answer. He had called her several times during the last few days, but she never picked up. She had missed an important charity event that she herself had founded years ago. That was not like her. Something was wrong, and Keanu could feel it deep inside. The door creaked open as he gently pushed it. The smell of old paint and dust filled the air. The floor was scattered with brushes, broken pencils, and canvases leaning against the walls. Soft moonlight entered through the cracks in the curtains, lighting up pieces of unfinished art. On one easel stood a half-completed portrait of a child holding a sunflower. The colors were bright but stopped halfway, as if the artist had run out of hope before finishing it. Keanu stepped inside slowly. His boots echoed on the wooden floor. He looked around and whispered softly, "Sandra, are you here?" There was no reply, only silence. He placed the flowers on a small table near the window and looked around again. Everything looked untouched for days, maybe weeks. Her apron still hung from the back of a chair. An empty cup of coffee sat beside a sketchbook. When he opened it, he found pages filled with quick pencil drawings, faces of strangers, smiles, tears, and hands reaching out to help others. Beneath one sketch, in her neat handwriting, were 3 words. "Kindness feels forgotten." Those words made his heart tighten. He had known Sandra for many years. Behind her laughter and success, she always carried a deep need to make the world better in quiet ways. She never liked attention for her good deeds. But after losing her mentor, the one who had taught her how to paint and see beauty in pain, she had started withdrawing from people. This studio had been her safe place, but now it looked like a memory left behind. As he walked deeper into the room, Keanu noticed something odd. On one side of the wall, several finished paintings were stacked together. Every painting showed someone ordinary: a janitor sweeping a hallway, a nurse holding a child, an old woman feeding birds, a street cleaner smiling under the rain. Each painting had a single word written at the bottom corner in light golden paint. Seen. He stood still for a long time, staring at them. It was as if Sandra had been painting invisible heroes, people who were never noticed but kept the world alive. And yet, something about these paintings felt unfinished, like they were waiting for a story to end. He turned to the main desk and noticed a small folded paper near the brush jar. When he opened it, his chest grew heavy. It was a note written in her voice, a mix of strength and sadness. It said, "Kindness fades when no one notices. Maybe silence is easier now." Keanu sat down, holding the note between his fingers. The sound of rain returning against the window made the moment heavier. He thought about all the times Sandra had spoken about hope, about believing in goodness even when the world seemed cruel. She had inspired so many people, yet she had lost that same belief herself. He looked around again and whispered to the empty room, "No, kindness doesn't fade. People just forget to look." For a few minutes, he sat there quietly thinking. He remembered a night years ago on the set of their film, The Lake House, when Sandra had told him that she painted not for fame, but for people who reminded her that kindness still existed. She had said, "When I paint someone, I try to make the world see them the way I do." Those words had stayed with him for years. But now, looking around her abandoned studio, Keanu realized she had stopped painting not because she didn't care anymore, but because she believed no one cared to notice. As he stood, he saw a faint glimmer under a pile of old canvases. Curiosity pulled him closer. Under them was a small wooden box with a note taped to the top. The note read, "Unfinished." He opened it carefully. Inside were folded letters, dozens of them, tied together with a faded red ribbon. Each letter seemed to come from different people. A street vendor, a young nurse, a man who had lost his home, a teacher. As Keanu read a few lines, he realized something unbelievable. These were letters from people whose lives Sandra had quietly helped. Some mentioned scholarships she funded without revealing her name. Others spoke of supplies donated to shelters or hospital bills suddenly paid in full by an anonymous donor. It hit him. She had kept these letters not for pride, but to remind herself why she painted. And now, even these reminders were hidden in a box called Unfinished. Then, among all those letters, he found one envelope without a stamp. It looked older than the rest. On the front, written in his own handwriting, were the words, "To SB, from a friend who never forgot." Keanu froze. He didn't remember writing it, but the handwriting was his. Trembling slightly, he opened it and began to read. Inside, the words were simple. "You once told me that real art comes from real kindness. You taught me to look at the world through gentle eyes. If you ever forget your light, let me remind you, you built mine." He sat in silence, holding that letter. It was something he had written years ago but never sent. He had written it after the lake house, when her kindness had helped him through one of his darkest times. Now, after all these years, fate had brought that letter back to her hands, through him. He placed it back in the box, closed it gently, and looked around the studio again. There was sadness in the air, but also something else. A quiet invitation, a soft whisper calling him to stay. He turned on the small lamp on the desk. The light spread across the room, reflecting on the unfinished painting of the child with the sunflower. The brush still rested beside it, dry and unused. He picked it up slowly, dipped it in color, and made the first stroke. He smiled faintly as he whispered, "Let's finish what you started." As the first rays of dawn began to touch the sky, the studio filled with soft light once more. Outside, the city continued to move, unaware that inside a forgotten building, one man had decided to bring hope back to life through the brush of another, and somewhere, miles away, Sandra Bullock opened her phone after weeks of silence, saw a message from Keanu and froze. It said only 2 words, "Come home." She didn't know what awaited her at the studio, but something inside her heart told her that the story of her kindness was about to begin again. The morning light spread gently through the thin curtains of the studio, painting the room with shades of gold and gray. Outside, the city slowly came alive with the sounds of traffic and distant voices. But inside, time seemed to move slower, almost respectfully quiet. Keanu sat near the easel, his eyes fixed on the half-finished portrait of the child holding a sunflower. The brush rested in his hand, trembling slightly from exhaustion. He had spent the entire night surrounded by her memories, the scent of paint, the texture of old letters, the ghost of Sandra's laughter that once filled these walls. He wasn't sure what drove him to stay, but something deep inside told him that walking away would mean letting her kindness disappear into silence. She had given light to so many lives. Now it was his turn to return that light. The studio door creaked open quietly. Soft footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Keanu turned his head slowly. There she was. Sandra Bullock stood in the doorway, wrapped in a long gray coat, her eyes tired but alert. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her face looked pale, as if she hadn't slept for days. She seemed unsure whether to smile or step back. Her gaze moved across the room, the flowers on the table, the scattered brushes, the lit lamp, and finally, the man sitting near her unfinished painting. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sandra's voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. Keanu looked up, his expression calm but firm. "You stopped coming here," he replied. She sighed, stepping inside slowly. "There's a reason for that," she whispered. He nodded. "I know. I found your note." Her eyes flickered for a moment, filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. She walked toward the window and looked outside. "It's strange," she said almost to herself. "People tell me they love my work, but they never ask about the people in it. They see the colors but not the souls. I painted kindness for years, and I started to wonder if anyone still saw it. Keanu rose from his chair, his voice gentle but steady. You were never painting for applause, he said. You were painting for truth. That truth still matters even when no one claps. She turned to face him, eyes glistening. Truth doesn't feed hope forever, Keanu. I thought if I stayed silent, maybe the noise of the world would stop hurting. He smiled faintly. Silence doesn't heal, Sandra. It only hides the wound. There was a long pause. She looked down and saw the open box on the table. Her heart skipped when she recognized the red ribbon. You found them, she whispered. Yes, he said. I read some. They loved you more than you ever realized. Her voice cracked. I didn't want anyone to know. I wasn't trying to be some quiet hero. I just wanted to help. And you did, he said gently. But now it's your turn to be reminded of what you gave. Sandra walked over to the table and picked up the letter on top. Her fingers trembled when she saw her own name written in faded ink, to SB from a friend who never forgot. She looked at Keanu in confusion. Who wrote this? He hesitated for a moment, then smiled sadly. Me, her eyes widened. You? He nodded. A long time ago, I wrote it after the lake house. I never sent it. You told me once that kindness keeps people alive, even when the world gives them reasons to quit. I didn't believe you then, but when I was lost, your words saved me. So I wrote that letter. I guess it found its way back here. Sandra held the letter tightly, her eyes filling with tears she had been holding for too long. You kept this all these years? No, he said softly. You did. Without knowing. She looked around the studio again. Her paintings, once symbols of hope, now looked like pieces of her own forgotten heart. Keanu walked closer to the easel and pointed at the child in the painting. Why did you stop here? He asked. Sandra smiled faintly. I couldn't finish. The child was supposed to hold something more than a sunflower, something brighter. But I didn't know what anymore. Keanu looked at the canvas for a long moment. Then let's find it together, he said quietly. She frowned. Together? He nodded. You started painting kindness. Let's finish it with remembrance. For the first time in months, a small laugh escaped her lips. You always had strange ways of fixing things. Maybe, he said. But this one feels right. She walked toward the shelf and picked up a clean brush. Her hands were unsteady, but the moment she touched it, a spark of something familiar returned. She dipped it in bright yellow paint and stared at the canvas. For a few seconds, she hesitated, then made the first stroke. Keanu stood beside her, watching quietly. The golden color bloomed on the canvas like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the next hour, the room filled with nothing but the sound of brushes and soft breathing. She painted and he watched, sometimes adding a small touch when she nodded. Together, they rebuilt what had once been lost. As they worked, she began talking again, her voice low and honest. My mentor used to say that art is just a mirror of the soul. When you stop painting, it means you stopped seeing, Keanu smiled. Then maybe it's time to see again. By noon, the painting had changed completely. The child now held not just a sunflower, but a heart-shaped lantern glowing with soft gold light. Around it, faint outlines of people appeared, the same faces from her other paintings, now connected by lines of light. Sandra stepped back, breathless. It looks alive, she whispered. It is, Keanu said quietly. Because you are. For a long moment, they both stared at the painting in silence. It wasn't just art anymore. It was a message. But as Keanu began cleaning the brushes, something caught his eye. Under the table, hidden beneath an old drop cloth, he noticed another canvas, one that looked much older. What's that? He asked. Sandra frowned, walking closer. She bent down, pulled the canvas out, and froze. It was a portrait of an older man with gentle eyes and a kind smile. Her late mentor. Across the bottom corner, faintly scratched into the paint, were the words, "Every light needs a keeper." Her breath caught in her throat. He never finished this. It was his last painting before he passed away. Keanu stared at it carefully. Look closer, he said softly. She leaned in and gasped. Under the old layers of color, hidden almost invisibly, was another line. If she ever forgets her gift, remind her. Sandra turned to Keanu, tears forming in her eyes. How did you know to come here tonight? He looked at her with quiet honesty. Because he told me to. She shook her head in disbelief. That's impossible. He's been gone for years. Keanu took a deep breath. A few weeks before he passed, he asked me to make him a promise. He said, if Sandra ever stops painting, remind her that the world still needs her light. I didn't understand what he meant then, but now I do. Her voice broke as tears finally rolled down her face. He knew this would happen. He knew kindness fades only when no one reminds it to shine, Keanu said softly. She covered her mouth, trying to hold back her sobs. He walked to her slowly and placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be strong alone anymore, he whispered. Sometimes kindness needs someone to protect it too. The two stood in silence for a while, surrounded by colors and memories, the golden afternoon light pouring through the window like a quiet blessing. As the hours passed, Sandra began to laugh again, softly at first, then freely. She cleaned the studio, organized her brushes, and reopened the windows. Fresh air filled the space. The walls that once held sorrow now glowed with new warmth. Keanu watched her closely. Something in her spirit had shifted. She wasn't healed completely, but she was no longer lost. Before leaving, she turned to him with a gentle smile. You kept your promise, she said. He smiled back. Not yet, he replied. The promise ends when you start sharing your light again. Sandra looked at the glowing painting one last time and whispered, Then I guess we're just getting started. And for the first time in months, the sound of her laughter mixed with the scent of paint and the warmth of sunlight, a melody the studio had been waiting to hear again. The next morning came softly, with a pale orange light spreading over Los Angeles. The rain had stopped completely, and the city seemed to breathe again. Birds perched quietly on power lines, their songs barely reaching the quiet corners of Sandra's old studio. Inside, the smell of fresh paint mixed with the calm scent of wildflowers that Keanu had brought the night before. Sandra arrived early, her steps light but careful, as if she feared that entering too loudly might wake a dream. She had not slept much, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. When she opened the door, she found Keanu already there, standing near the painting they had finished together. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, one for her just the way she liked. Simple, no sugar, no cream. You came back early, she said with a soft smile. I didn't really leave, he replied. The studio felt alive again. I wanted to keep it that way, she smiled, taking the cup from his hand. You've always had strange timing, he laughed quietly. Maybe, or maybe this place needed both of us. For a few minutes, they just stood there, watching the sunlight move slowly across the walls, touching every painting one by one. The golden tones made the faces in her art glow with warmth. The janitor, the nurse, the street vendor, the teacher. They all looked alive, as if kindness itself had stepped out of the colors to greet the morning. But then Sandra noticed something odd. Near the far corner of the room, one of the canvases had a faint shimmer under the light, like there was something hidden beneath the paint. She walked closer and ran her hand gently over the surface. It was a portrait of a woman holding a book. But under the texture, she could feel thin layers of another painting below. This one feels strange, she said quietly. Keanu tilted his head, curious. Maybe there's something under it. Sandra picked up a small knife from the table, carefully scraping the edge of the frame. As she did, a hidden layer of colors began to emerge, faded but visible. She frowned, brushing away the dust, and soon realized that the older painting was not of a person at all. It was of a place, a park. She stepped back slowly. Wait, she whispered. I know this place. Keanu looked closer. Where is it? New Orleans, she said softly. It's where I first started painting for real. My mentor used to take me there to draw people by the fountain. He always said that kindness lives in ordinary places, not in grand stages. She stared at the image for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly. I painted over it years ago. I didn't even realize it. Keanu crossed his arms, thoughtful. Maybe he wanted you to remember it again. Sandra turned to him, puzzled. You think he meant for me to find this? Maybe not just you, he said. Maybe us. His tone carried a quiet weight, something that made her stop and listen closely. She had learned over the years that Keanu rarely spoke without purpose. His words often hid deeper meanings, quiet truths meant to guide rather than impress. "What do you mean?" she asked. He walked around the painting, tracing the faint outlines with his eyes. "This park," he said. "It's not just where you started. It's where kindness started for you. Maybe your mentor left something there, something he wanted you to find." She raised an eyebrow. "After all these years?" He smiled gently. "Kindness doesn't expire. It waits." For a while they said nothing. Only the sound of the city drifted through the window. Sandra looked at the hidden image again, and a small, almost forgotten warmth spread through her chest. A memory of laughter, of sunlight reflecting on water, of her mentor handing her a sketchbook and saying, "Paint what you feel, not what you see." "What if he did leave something?" she whispered. "Then we'll go find it," Keanu said simply. Later that afternoon, they locked the studio and drove together toward the old part of New Orleans. The journey was long but quiet, filled with soft music and moments of comfortable silence. Sandra looked out the window most of the time, lost in thought, while Keanu focused on the road, his expression calm and steady as always. When they finally reached the city, the air felt heavier, warm, humid, alive with distant jazz and the scent of old streets. They walked through narrow alleys until they reached the park from the painting. Time had changed it, but not its heart. The fountain still stood in the center, surrounded by benches and large oak trees. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing in the breeze. Sandra stopped at one of the benches and ran her hand across the worn wood. Carved faintly into the side were the initials HB, her mentor's name, Henry Bellman. "He used to sit here every morning," she said quietly, watching people, sketching them, talking to strangers like they were old friends. Keanu looked around. If he left something, it might be near here. They searched for nearly an hour, checking behind the benches, near the trees, around the fountain. Sandra began to lose hope, but then something caught her eye. A small metal plaque hidden under ivy near the base of the fountain. She knelt down and brushed the leaves away. The plaque read, "To those who see kindness, even when the world turns away." Beneath it was a small, rusted keyhole. Her breath caught. "A key," she whispered. "But to what?" Keanu looked at her carefully. "Did your mentor ever give you something to keep locked?" She thought for a moment, then gasped. "Yes, the box in my studio. The one marked unfinished." He smiled softly. "Then maybe it's not finished after all." They returned to Los Angeles the next day, the key wrapped safely in Sandra's handkerchief. By the time they reached the studio, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Sandra unlocked the door with a mix of excitement and fear. She placed the key into the old wooden box, and with a soft click, it opened fully for the first time. Inside were more letters, but these were different. They were not written by strangers. They were written by her mentor. Each one dated from years ago, addressed to "My brightest student." Sandra began reading them one by one, her eyes widening with every line. Her mentor had known she would face doubt someday. He had written words for that moment, words to remind her that even when kindness goes unseen, it never disappears. It simply changes shape and waits to be rediscovered by those who believe in it. One letter stood out from the rest. It was the last one. It read, "If you ever forget the reason you paint, ask the man who believes in you most. He will remind you." She froze, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Keanu. "He meant you," she whispered. Keanu lowered his head slightly, a soft smile forming on his lips. "Then I guess I'm just doing my part." Sandra placed the letters gently back in the box and closed it. "He trusted you," she said quietly. "No," Keanu replied. "He trusted your light." The two stood there for a long time, surrounded by the fading sunlight and the quiet hum of the city. For the first time, Sandra didn't feel alone with her memories. She felt seen, understood, and guided, not by fame, not by praise, but by a circle of kindness that began long before she even realized it. As night settled, Keanu looked at the glowing painting on the easel and said, "Your mentor's message isn't finished yet. He wanted the world to see it, not just you." Sandra nodded slowly. "Then we'll show it," she whispered. "But not in galleries or press events. We'll show it where kindness still breathes." And as the lights of Los Angeles flickered outside, a quiet plan began to form. One that would soon turn their rediscovered art into something that would touch millions of hearts. Days passed quietly after the discovery of the letters. Sandra spent long hours in her studio reading them one by one. Each page felt like a voice from the past, gentle and wise, guiding her through the fog she had built around her heart. Keanu visited every day, never rushing her, never asking her to speak. He simply sat nearby, fixing broken frames or cleaning brushes, giving her the space to feel without being alone. It was on the 5th evening that she finally looked up from the final letter and said softly, "He never wanted fame. He just wanted people to remember that kindness creates ripples, that even a small act can reach someone miles away." Keanu nodded quietly. "That sounds like him." She placed the letter back in the box and took a deep breath. "Then that's what I want to do. Not just paint. I want to create something that reminds people of that ripple." He leaned forward. "Well, what do you have in mind?" She hesitated, thinking carefully. "A foundation," she whispered. "A place that supports artists, students, anyone who wants to create something for good. Something that keeps unseen kindness alive." Keanu's expression softened. "And what will you call it?" She smiled faintly. "The Unseen Hands." He repeated it slowly, almost reverently. "The Unseen Hands," he nodded. "It fits. It's what your mentor stood for. It's what you've always done." That night they worked late. Sandra drafted ideas while Keanu handled calls and contacts quietly. By midnight, the plan had taken shape. An open art and outreach project that would travel from city to city, displaying works from unknown artists and stories of people who had changed lives without ever seeking recognition. When the first announcement went live, there was no mention of their names. It simply read, "A tribute to kindness that lives unseen." The reaction was small at first. Only a few local reporters noticed. But as images of the glowing painting of the child holding the lantern spread online, something unexpected happened. People began sharing stories of their own, strangers helping strangers, teachers buying supplies for students, doctors treating patients without charge, neighbors supporting each other in silence. Sandra sat in her studio one evening, scrolling through the posts. Her eyes filled with tears. "Look at this," she whispered to Keanu. "It's working. People remember?" He smiled, watching her face light up again. "It's not just working," he said. "It's growing." Soon, letters started arriving again. Not to thank Sandra, but to thank the Unseen Hands. The name had become a symbol. People who didn't know each other began signing their good deeds with the phrase, "From Unseen Hands." It was as if her old dream of spreading quiet kindness had taken a new breath. One morning, a small envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. A classroom in India where children were painting the same glowing lantern from Sandra's work. On the back, someone had written, "We saw your light. Now it's ours, too." She held the picture against her chest, smiling through tears. "I wish he could see this," she whispered, thinking of her mentor. Keanu placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maybe he already does," he said softly. Weeks turned into months, and the Unseen Hands Foundation began spreading across countries. Schools, shelters, and communities started their own art corners where people painted kindness they had witnessed. Every piece carried the same golden mark, a small heart glowing inside a handprint. But behind all the success, something still bothered Sandra. One night, while reviewing an old stack of canvases, she noticed something strange. One painting, a landscape she barely remembered finishing, had a faint mark near the edge. She held it closer under the light and saw it clearly this time. Carved beneath the surface were the same initials as the ones on the bench in New Orleans, HB. Her breath caught. She called Keanu immediately. "Come here. I think he left another message." He arrived within minutes. She showed him the carving. He studied it closely, running his fingers over the letters. "This wasn't random," he said. "Your mentor knew you would find this when your work was ready again." She frowned. "But why now?" He looked at the painting carefully, then turned it over. Taped to the back was a folded piece of yellow paper, worn and fragile with age. Sandra opened it slowly, afraid it might crumble. Inside was a sketch, not of a person, but of two hands holding a small lantern together. Underneath it, her mentor had written, "When your light returns, it will not return alone." She looked up at Keanu, confused but deeply moved. "What does that mean?" He smiled quietly. "Maybe it means this wasn't just your journey. It was meant for both of us." She didn't answer, but her heart trembled. For the first time, she began to understand that this story of rediscovery wasn't only about her pain or her loss. It was also about connection, about how kindness moves from one heart to another, changing shape but never dying. The next week, they were invited to speak at an international art and humanity summit. Sandra hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted the spotlight again, but Keanu encouraged her gently. "You're not going there to talk about yourself," he said. "You're going to talk about them, the unseen hands." The day of the summit arrived. The hall was grand and filled with artists, leaders, and students from around the world. The lights were bright and the stage seemed enormous. Sandra felt nervous as she stepped up to the podium. Keanu stood behind her quietly, giving her a reassuring nod. She began softly, her voice steady but emotional. "I stopped painting for a long time," she said. "I thought kindness had faded from the world. But I was wrong. I just stopped looking for it." The audience listened closely. Her words carried warmth and honesty, touching everyone in the room. She spoke of her mentor, of forgotten heroes, of quiet kindness that still lived in ordinary lives. When she finished, she said, "This painting behind me isn't mine alone. It belongs to every unseen hand that ever helped someone without asking for anything back." The hall stood in silence for a few seconds, then erupted into applause. Cameras flashed, but she didn't smile for fame. She smiled for peace. After the speech, several young artists approached her with tears in their eyes. One girl handed her a small sketchbook. Inside it were drawings of people helping each other, neighbors, friends, strangers. The girl said, "I wanted to stop drawing last year, but your story changed my mind." "Thank you." Sandra hugged her softly. "Don't stop," she whispered. "The world needs your heart." As they left the event that night, Keanu walked beside her quietly. "You did something powerful today," he said. She shook her head. "We did, it was both of us. Maybe even more than us," he smiled. "And maybe that's what kindness really is. Something that never belongs to one person alone." They drove back to the studio in silence. The night sky was clear, and the city lights twinkled like distant stars. When they arrived, Sandra looked at the glowing painting again and whispered, "He was right. My light didn't return alone." Keanu smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the warm glow from the painting. "And it never will again." The studio felt alive once more, not just with art, but with gratitude, purpose, and something deeper that words could never fully capture. The following week brought a quiet kind of excitement that neither Sandra nor Keanu expected. The Unseen Hands project had grown far beyond what they imagined. Schools, art groups, and even small villages across the world were now painting lanterns of kindness. Every message they received carried stories of hope: a mother feeding hungry children, a nurse working through storms, a student helping rebuild a library. But one message stood out. It came in an unmarked envelope with no sender name. The handwriting was delicate and neat, and inside was a single sentence. "To understand the light, you must finish the last canvas." Sandra frowned as she read it. "What last canvas?" she asked softly. Keanu looked thoughtful. "Maybe the one you never dared to start." She paused, confused. "But I've painted everything. Every idea, every feeling," he smiled faintly. "Not everything. There's one story you've never painted. Your own." His words hung in the air like quiet thunder. She didn't answer right away. Deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent years painting others, Strangers, forgotten faces, heroes in silence. But never once had she painted herself. Perhaps she was afraid of what she might see. That night, after Keanu left, Sandra sat alone in the studio. The moonlight spilled across the floor, touching the brushes and canvases like a soft reminder. She placed a blank canvas on the easel and stared at it for a long time. The silence was heavy but somehow peaceful. She dipped her brush into pale gold paint, the same color as the lantern from her earlier work. Then she began. Her strokes were slow at first, uncertain. But as the hours passed, her movements grew stronger, her breathing steadier. The image that appeared on the canvas wasn't of her face or her reflection. It was something else, something deeper. In the painting, she stood in the middle of a quiet studio, holding a lantern that glowed brighter than the stars. Behind her, unseen hands, dozens of them, reached out from the shadows, not to take, but to give. Some hands carried brushes, some held flowers, some offered light. When she finished, tears rolled down her cheeks. She whispered to the empty room. "This isn't just me. This is everyone who ever believed in kindness." She stepped back and smiled softly. But just as she turned to clean her brushes, she noticed something strange on the edge of the painting, faint letters forming where the paint had not yet dried. She leaned closer and her heart skipped. The letters were initials. HB, her mentor's name again. How, she whispered, she hadn't written it. No one else had touched the painting. Yet somehow, the signature appeared on its own, just like it had on the hidden landscape. Just then, Keanu entered the studio quietly. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" She pointed at the painting, her hands trembling. "Look." He walked closer, staring at the faint golden initials. The light from the lamp shimmered across the paint, and for a brief moment, the whole image seemed alive. The lantern glowed softly, reflecting in both of their eyes. Keanu whispered, "He's still here." Sandra swallowed hard. "But how? This can't be real." He nodded slowly. "Maybe not real in the way we understand. But kindness doesn't vanish. It finds its way back." She wiped her tears and smiled through the shock. "He was the unseen hand all along," she said quietly. "The one guiding everything, even after he was gone." Keanu placed a hand over his heart. "And maybe he wasn't the only one." She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment, then walked to the far corner of the studio. He picked up the wooden box marked unfinished. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said softly. Sandra's eyes widened. "What?" He opened the box carefully. Under the old letters and sketches was another envelope, sealed and untouched. He handed it to her. "I found this weeks ago. I didn't want to show you until you were ready." She stared at him, then opened the envelope. Inside was a small photograph, her mentor standing beside a young man. Her breath caught when she looked closer. The young man was Keanu. Her voice trembled. "When was this taken?" "Many years ago," he said quietly. "Before he passed away. I met him during a charity project in New Orleans. I didn't even know he was your mentor at the time. He spoke about a student who painted kindness into the world. He told me she would one day lose faith, and that I might be the one to remind her." She stood frozen, staring at him. "You knew?" He shook his head slowly. "Not at first. Not until I saw your painting years later. Then I realized he was talking about you." The room fell silent. Sandra's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of understanding, not sorrow. "So everything that happened, every step that brought us here, was meant to happen," he finished gently. "It was never coincidence. It was his kindness connecting us both." She placed the photograph beside the lantern painting. For a long moment they both stared at it, feeling the strange warmth that filled the air, as if the mentor himself was standing quietly with them. "Proud and peaceful," Sandra whispered. "He always said that kindness is like light. It travels even when you can't see it." "Maybe he knew his light would travel through you." Keanu smiled faintly. "And through you, it reached the world." The next day, the Unseen Hands Foundation held its first global exhibition. Thousands of people gathered in cities around the world, painting, singing, and sharing their own stories of unseen kindness. Every gallery displayed her final painting, the woman holding the lantern, surrounded by giving hands, with one line written beneath it, "Kindness never dies. It only changes hands." The exhibition became a symbol of hope, not just for artists, but for everyone who believed in doing good quietly. Later that night, when the event was over, Sandra and Keanu returned to the studio. They stood together in front of the lantern painting, now glowing softly under golden light. Sandra said quietly, "Do you think he knows what he started?" Keanu looked at her and smiled. "I think he does. And I think he's still painting, just with different colors now." The two of them stood side by side, watching the light dance across the canvas, knowing that the story they had lived was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone who still believed in kindness, even in silence, and as the clock struck midnight, the faint shimmer of the initials HB glowed once more before fading gently into the paint, as if saying goodbye, or maybe saying thank you. The days following the global exhibition were filled with warmth and reflection. News channels and social media spoke endlessly about the Unseen Hands project, but Sandra and Keanu avoided interviews. They didn't want the story to be about them. They wanted it to stay pure, about kindness, not fame. Still, something had changed around them. Wherever they went, they saw traces of the movement they had started. Small lantern symbols appeared on school walls, park benches, and hospital rooms. People whispered stories of gratitude, sharing how strangers had helped them when no one else would. Kindness had become a quiet wave, spreading without noise. Inside her studio, Sandra sat one evening watching the sunset. The light fell across her final painting, the one with the woman holding the lantern surrounded by unseen hands. The golden tones shimmered as if alive, and she smiled softly. Keanu entered with 2 cups of tea, his steps slow and peaceful. "You've been quiet," he said gently. "Just thinking," she replied, "about how strange it feels. We didn't plan any of this. It just happened," he nodded. "That's how kindness works. You can't plan it. It just finds the right people." She looked at him with gratitude in her eyes. "Do you ever think about how all this started? Just one evening, an empty studio, and a bouquet of wildflowers." He laughed softly. "I remember. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. And instead," she said, "you brought the world back to me." For a moment, neither spoke. They just sat there in silence, listening to the quiet hum of the evening. It was the same studio that had once felt like a graveyard of lost dreams. Now it was alive again, glowing with new meaning. Sandra stood up and walked toward a shelf where she kept her old sketchbooks. She pulled one out, its pages filled with faces she had drawn years ago. Strangers she had met. People who inspired her. People who had no idea they had been immortalized in her art. At the very end of the book, there was one blank page left. She picked up a pencil and looked at Keanu. "I think this page belongs to you," she said. He shook his head slowly. "No, I've had enough light for one lifetime," she smiled. "Then maybe it's for all the people like you, the ones who carry light without ever asking to be seen." And she began to draw. Her hands moved gently, shaping a figure that looked calm, kind, and humble. When she finished, the sketch showed a man standing under soft light, surrounded by shadows that reached toward him, not to take, but to learn. When she showed it to Keanu, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he said quietly, "You didn't draw me. You drew what kindness looks like," she smiled softly. "Maybe they're the same thing." They both laughed, not loudly, but in that peaceful way that only happens when hearts understand each other without words. As weeks passed, the Unseen Hands Foundation expanded to over 20 countries. It became a global art movement combining creativity and compassion. Artists donated paintings, teachers built free art programs, and people began leaving lantern symbols near hospitals and schools as signs of hope. One evening, the foundation held a memorial event for Sandra's mentor, Henry Bellman. Thousands joined through live streams and local gatherings. Sandra stood on the stage with Keanu beside her, the painting of the lantern displayed behind them. She spoke softly but firmly. Henry Bellman taught me that kindness is not an action. It's a language. You don't speak it with words. You speak it with what you give, with what you forgive, and with what you build. Tonight, I hope this light reminds you that the world still listens to kindness, even when it seems silent. The audience stood in quiet respect. Many wiped tears from their eyes. As she finished, the stage lights dimmed and hundreds of small lanterns lit up across the crowd, glowing like golden stars. Keanu whispered beside her, "Look at that. Every one of them is a story?" She nodded. And every story came from one unseen hand. When they returned to the studio later that night, the air felt peaceful, almost sacred. They placed the last lantern on the table, the same one used during the exhibition. Sandra looked at Keanu and said softly, "Do you ever wonder what happens when kindness finally reaches everyone?" He smiled gently. "Then it starts again. From someone new," she nodded. "Maybe that's how the world stays alive." The clock struck midnight, and the golden light from the lantern flickered softly, casting reflections on every painting in the room. Each face, each brushstroke, each memory seemed to glow together, all pieces of one larger truth. Sandra whispered, "He's still here, isn't he?" Keanu looked at the light and smiled. Always. And as they stood there in silence, the faint initials HB shimmered once again in the corner of the final painting. This time they didn't fade. Instead, they glowed brighter than ever before, filling the studio with a warmth that felt like a soft goodbye. Tears rolled down Sandra's cheeks, but she was smiling. She turned to Keanu and said, "I think we've finished the story he started." Keanu shook his head slowly. "No," he said quietly. "We've just begun the next one." The lantern burned steadily between them, its flame small but endless. A reminder that kindness, once lit, never truly ends. It moves from hand to hand, from heart to heart, painting the world in colors that never fade. Outside, dawn broke over the city. Golden light entered the windows of the small studio where one quiet act of compassion had become a movement that would outlive them both. And in that light, two souls, one painter and one believer, stood together, smiling at the world they had helped make a little kinder.